Hi, this is Marco Nicoluk, and today I'd like to share something really special with you. It's a conversation that I've had with Steve and Randall, a tech visionary and entrepreneur who back in the 80s invented the first ever digital guitar, Stepp DG1. We'll talk about the evolution of MIDI guitars and other music making tools, diving deep into the story and the technology behind Stepp Guitar, and draw some comparison with Jammy and other tools available today. You'll also find out what Les Paul thought about digital guitars and how many Prophet synths you can fit into a guitar. Let's dive right in. Is DG1 the only model that you had, or was there also?
It was the DG1, which is the first digital guitar one, but we also did a DGX, which is pretty much exactly this, but this has its own voices, which I very rarely play because you can't MIDI control the voices. So this is, I'm using this like DGX. DGX didn't have its own voices, so it's just the controller, and it was less than half the price of this. It was $1,500.
Can you take me back before the Stepp days? Did you start out as an artist, songwriter?
Yes, I was a professional songwriter, and I was doing a lot of things like music jingles. I had a couple of covers, but nothing that was a massive hit or anything. And my music publisher basically said to me, look, if this doesn't work, what's your plan B? And I said to him, I had this idea for because I'm a guitarist primarily. I couldn't really play piano. And I said, I had this idea to do a digital guitar that would be for a guitarist the same as a keyboard is for a piano player. And he was like, oh, that's brilliant, brilliant. Why don't you do that? And I said, well, I don't know anything about electronics. And it's so we can raise money, we can get electronics people. And it was just, okay. And this was my publisher. So he was my partner. We raised £1.5 million. So about those days, it was about $3 million. And we were so naive, but I think we didn't know how difficult it was. So we did it. And then we worked with Dave Simmons, who did the Simmons drums. So yeah, I went from being a songwriter into being more of an entrepreneur in electronics. And it was a baptism by fire.
And when did you start on that project? When was the beginning of
it? Was
Stepp
the late
Guitar?
80s. I think we might have started in 86 or 87, something like that. It took us a couple of years to make the first guitar. And it was actually a pretty good time to be launching a digital guitar because it was at the time where New Romantic and synth music was going through a boom. So you had, Culture Club and Duran Duran and, all that kind of music. And they were the kind of people and the producers that were open to using that kind of instrument.
Can you give us a better glimpse at it?
So what we've got, very similar to Jammy, we've got, although it may not be obvious, in the middle, there's a cap which covers the termination of the neck strings and the strum strings. And the reason that we needed to split the strings, probably similar to Jammy, is that if you've got metal strings on a metal fret and you play a chord, you can't work out electrically which notes are being played. So you have to either cut the human being in half or cut the strings in half. So we thought it was easier to cut the strings in half. So we detect touching the strings on the right-hand side. We detect touching the strings on the left-hand side as separate sensors. And then the frets aren't metal; they're semiconductive. They're made of a resistive material on top, ceramic, and it's like a semiconductor. So when you touch a string onto a fret, it is detecting it. But as you move the string across the fret, it's then a resistor. So it's like bending the note as well. So that's how we do pitch bend. And then on the right-hand side, we're just detecting the pluck. Touch and pluck velocity, slide chords around. Like Jammy, we don't have any latency issues because it's a switch. It's as soon as you press a string onto a fret, makes a connection. So there's no latency issues.
How do you pick up the vibration of the strings? What's the physics of the pickup?
Funnily enough, the pickup we have more problem with than the frets. In the middle here, you can see these are pickups, and they detect the movement of the string in velocity-wise.
Are they like magnetic pickups?
Yes, essentially yes, but they're very basic, and we found that we had quite a lot of trouble with the dynamic sensitivity and evenness of strumming. The very first generation of the DG1, you had to use a metal pick because the metal pick would give more sensitivity to the fact that you were coming after you've strummed a note. The next note would see the touch and stop and then play again. But then we improved the software, and you don't need to use a metal pick anymore. So this side is basically just measuring dynamics. This side is measuring the pitch, and both sides are measuring touch.
What is the output from the Stepp, and where does it go?
Oh, there's I can't remember if it's maybe a 18 cable lead. This goes to what we call the LSU, which is the life support unit. I don't know how big this cable is, but you might be able to see. Can you see that there?
Ooh, yeah.
Okay, so this is both a stand for the guitar. The guitar sits in that, but at the back of this, the guitar plugs into that, and then we've got MIDI out, and we've got foot pedals and other stuff that you can plug in. So, the main interface to the rest of the world was from the LSU, and you've got
looks quite heavy too.
Well, the stand was deliberately, it is fairly heavy, but the stand was, basically you've got a keyboard synth split between two parts. The guitar is the weight of a Gibson Les Paul, maybe even a bit heavier. We've got this was ABS plastic, but molded around a chunk of metal, so there's a metal rod in the neck that it's molded around to give the stiffness. And then you've got, quite a big printed circuit board jammed with 6 processors, so a processor per string, two Curtis chip per string. So there's this whole inside is basically electronics, but the LSU is basically power and MIDI.
Is there any electronics in the headstock?
The headstock, I don't know if you can see it. The headstock is purely where we terminate the strings. And an Allen key in here. So now I know a lot more about manufacturing and electronics and everything else. I realized how expensive this was.
This portion on the top, what of the body, what does that allow you to do?
This is an interface into the synthesizer. If you think of each string as a monophonic synthesizer, each string has 2 oscillators with an envelope and filters and tuning. So you can control the oscillators. You could tune the oscillators to be maybe an octave apart or slightly different, so you get a 12-string effect. We use the same chips that were in the Prophet 5, the Curtis chips. So it's an analog synthesizer with digital tuning. You've got basically 12 synthesizers. It's a Prophet 5 basically in each string. And then you've got the tuning and the MIDI side. So the DGX basically had the tuning and the MIDI stuff. And the tuning, I think, is incredibly important for a digital guitar. So, in normal tuning, a guitar is E, A, D, G, B, E. But we would often show this because if I just press the tuning button, this is an encoder that can do anything. So it's so if I tune, so I can see this is now tuned. I'll go up to E3. So this is now. So obviously a guitarist isn't used to being able to tune either that quickly without strings breaking and the neck bending. So if I play a classical guitar sound tuned up like that, it sounds completely different. If I go back to the tuning go back to an original tuning. So,
is there an indicator? Is that like a screen?
Yes. So I'm looking at an LED display, which you might not be able to see there.
Oh, I see there. Yeah.
It shows this. So at the moment, I'm tuning all strings, but I could tune individual strings. But I'm just tuning all the strings. So now it's back in E2. But I can also press the chord button and play a chord. I'll do that again.
And so now that chord becomes the open tuning.
Now that is the open tuning. So
this is sweet. You know, obviously, these days when you need like the interface for something, you normally turn to the mobile device. And
yes.
So, yeah, for the tunings, you probably saw the section that you have here where you can pick one of the tunings, and also like we added this, which is sort of like the wheel, maybe not as satisfying as spinning that wheel to go up in the tuning, but basically a similar concept where like I can go by just hitting the transpose button.
So on the Stepp, I can either tune all 6 or tune individual. So if at the moment I'm tuned to EADGBE, but if I then go in and change the 6th string down an octave, so I've got that. Immediately sounds much more menacing. And now. So that's just one, no different patch, but just tuning the E string down to an octave below, and it's, you know, it kind of conjures up just immediately a different kind of feel. We discovered very quickly that a lot of guitarists have their own tricks, but also if you're more of a songwriter versus a guitarist, which certainly I was, sometimes you need to find a different tuning just so you don't fall into the same traps. So sometimes just having that, chord tuning where suddenly things aren't so familiar, you accidentally discover new voicings. You might still find out you're going from E to A to B, but you're more inspired because, you know, the brain isn't falling into the same traps.
Yeah.
So again, depending on how you want to use the instrument, whether it's for live work and for quickly dialing up different sounds, or for studio work, playing, you know, a flute sound on a guitar, or just for inspiration, they dictate different modes of use. And it's so open-ended. It's very exciting.
So in terms of like the people who used the Stepp DG1, did they fall into this same category of songwriter, or were there different kinds of approaches?
We had a guy who worked for us. He would make sounds on the Stepp that were clearly kind of guitar origins, but they didn't sound like anything else. And we intuitively felt that we needed more musicians like him that would take this as the starting point, much like people like Hendrix and Clapton and other guitarists. They didn't just play an electric guitar like it was an amplified acoustic guitar. They used all the sounds that an electric guitar could make that no other instrument could make, and suddenly you've got types of music that millions of people want to emulate. So we had people like Steve Howe, who's a pioneer and an astonishingly brilliant guitarist, and people like Andy Summers. So these are guitarists. But we also had producers who were obviously great good enough guitarists, but they were hearing sounds that they couldn't translate any other way other than a guitar. So people like Terry Britton, who was producing Tina Turner, might say, I want to do a flute sound, but he may not have had the language to tell the keyboard player, play, whatever. Oh, that was awful because I'm still about 20 octaves high. But he could pick this up with a flute sound and just play it. but we also had people like the Bee Gees and Kate Bush and Go West and Duran Duran and other, that were possibly just using it experimentally. That these artists were using the Fairlight and all sorts of instruments just to create new music.
Were there any mainstream songs that people might know that were using the digital guitar?
A few. I mean, Steve Hackett had a whole album of guitar synth stuff that was very prog rock in its day. The Bee Gees had in the UK a #1 hit called "You Win Again" or "We Win." I think "You Win Again," where the guitar they were using a DGX. Sounds you can see it on some videos. Sounds very synthy, but it's sort of guitar voicing. Go West used it in quite a lot of their recordings and live as well. And Kate Bush in I think it was called Experiment #5 or Experiment #1 or Experiment #9. I can't remember the number, but she was using it with a lot of, I think she had 2 Fairlights. So
back in the 80s, when guitarists with a traditional mindset would stumble upon the Stepp guitar, what was their feedback about it? What were some of the common misconceptions that they had about it when they first touched it? And what features did they tend to like the most about it?
It was all over the shop and probably very similar experience to what you've had. Some guitarists were looking at how I can use this in the studio. So, for example, if I'm going to do a lead on for some people this is maybe heresy, but if I'm going to do a lead and it's not right, I'm going to do it again and again until I get it right. On a MIDI guitar, I can do a lead, and if I didn't get it right, I'll go in and fix that note. I can fix the timing. I can change it completely. So for some guitarists, I think that's fine. I'm still using my creativity in this language, and I'm using the tools to get what I want from my brain into the system. For other guitarists, no, if you're not a player, then that's not right. I don't want to say what's wrong or what's right. If you're a guitarist that just maybe doesn't have the chops, or you have the chops and maybe you want to do something that's impossible, that was one aspect where some people really gravitated towards it and other people just wanted to use it as a guitar. Some people wanted it to be an instrument that they could use live to replace multiple guitars. And I'm not sure that we solved that problem because of MIDI and because we hadn't really designed it that way. So maybe we would have had more kind of foot pedals and things. So I think that may have been a bit scary for those kind of guitarists. And I think other guitarists were just using it because it had different sounds. But to be honest, there was also a large group of guitarists that were just scared of it. You can have a guitarist who's, whether they're well known or not, they're really comfortable with their guitar or their guitars, and they come to this. And if they're the kind of guitarist that doesn't get it, suddenly they feel like they're a novice again, and so they wouldn't try. And you have to almost encourage those people that, well, the interface is the starting point. If you could stand over them, you could kind of tune it because it's got left and right hand strings that are separate. Some guitarists don't realize that they're not that well coordinated. So if I pluck a string a few milliseconds before I fret it, on a guitar, you can get away with that. There may be enough velocity in the string for it still to ring out. On a digital guitar, depending on how the software interprets it, it may be interpreted as no note, a muted note, the wrong note. So we would have to, over generations of software, say, well, how can we maybe with AI, or we can understand that velocity, still do exactly what happens on a real guitar? And we didn't get to the generation that translated that. So on the Stepp, if you don't play cleanly, you can get those wrong notes or muted notes, which isn't what you played.
I see.
And you could be picking the first string but fretting the second string because you're not feeling the physical string. You know, what's going on here? You know, and then you have, oh, okay. So you've never experienced, because your guitar has one set of strings, not two sets of strings. You either say, oh, okay, I understand, I'll get used to it, or no, this is too weird for me.
And this sounds very relatable, because there's multiple times when I showed the Jammy to the musicians, and I would go like, you know, like, look, it's not doing anything. I'm playing, and I'm like, you're picking the second string but fretting the third one, and they're like, oh yeah. And then also to the other thing that you pointed out, that coordination is key here. In a lot of instances, I was advising to, you know, start really slow and then pick up the speed as they go. And it feels a little bit different than it is on a regular guitar, but over the time, yeah, you learn how to coordinate the hands pretty well. And certainly for like the chords, it's pretty it's a pretty natural kind of strumming and picking experience. So I
certainly relate to all of those issues, and we would have gone through similar learning curves with people that come to it excited, and then maybe, you know, I think that their expectations aren't primed for these kind of issues, and you might tune a guitar to be more or less, you know, average for everybody, but there'll be people either side of that average that just don't get on with it, and they may want to adjust hammer-on velocity or sliding velocity or whatever it is, and think, okay, I've solved that problem, and then not realize that when they do something else, suddenly they're getting all these extra notes. So it almost requires that the guitarist understands a little bit about how it is doing this. And that may not be everybody. I think that once you've got the physics understanding and the sensors understanding every touch and slide and everything, software can evolve. It may be that you have different interfaces, so that if you're a lead guitarist, the starting point will automatically adjust hammer-ons, but if you're a rhythm guitarist, the starting point might be different. So instead of trying to adjust all of these very subtle things that you think you're helping yourself, but then you don't realize when you go to play a different style, suddenly it's messed up. Or maybe there's AI that kind of will automatically say, well, if he's playing 6 strings together and he's playing at this speed, I'm going to dynamically adjust these things.
What's the story behind going from the DG1 to the DGX, and how many years did it take you to sort of pivot, or was it a pivot, or was it just the next logical step in your product line?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was a little bit of both. We were under financial pressure to have a more mainstream product, as always with electronics. You know, you want to sell tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and we were in the kind of single thousands. So we realized that if we take away all the oscillators and the Curtis chips and the Prophet 5 synths, we could get the price down to less than half. And it would still be essentially the same instrument, just a MIDI controller, and appeal to a lot more guitarists. So it was really an evolution of the strategy. And we were under financial pressure to sell more. And just at the point we came out with the DGX, the company was acquired. And the company that acquired us was a lot less interested in continuing that roadmap. They just wanted to sell as many as possible. So that was a problem for us, because it needs continual development to improve, get the feedback from the guitarists, make it cheaper, add features. So we didn't have that luxury, and it's partly why I see in Jammy that there's maybe the opportunity to continue that mission.
one of the things you mentioned was like the price range. So it seems like, you know, in the end of the 80s, it was a pretty expensive, a pretty expensive equipment to own a MIDI guitar. You mentioned SynthAxe was 10,000
pounds,
10,000
about
pounds,
close to $20,000 in its day.
and then the Stepp guitar was. I'm sorry, Fairlight was how much?
Fairlight was, I think, between $50,000 and 100. Yeah, it was really, that was pretty much the most expensive piece of equipment. So if you could afford a Fairlight, you could probably afford an interface.
Anything. Yeah, I see. And Stepp guitar was 3,500 pounds, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I think it was $3,500 as well. I think we tried, although it would probably have translated into $5,000, which for a guitarist was a lot of money, but for a synth player it wasn't. And that was another thing we had to navigate. We would say, look, this has got 6 Prophet 5s in it, and a Prophet 5 was $2,500. So this is, you know, quite good value. But a guitarist was, you know, hey man, I can get a Gibson Les Paul for $600 at the time. And
I agree. And yeah, guitarists still compare digital guitars to regular guitars in price. And yeah, thankfully they've become more affordable these days, and yes, you can get one for a few $100. But apart from the price, what else do you think has changed in the MIDI guitar world since the 80s? What were some of the developments, and what other approaches maybe have you seen throughout this time?
Well, obviously with Moore's law, technology is cheaper, but I don't think much, until Jammy came along, I don't think much has actually changed. It's like from the 80s through till you know, let's say the last 2 or 3 years, the only real guitar synthesis out there was, you know, things like pitch to voltage that Roland started, and you can see with the Fishman interface. There was the Variax, which actually I like, but that's not really a guitar synth. That's really a modeled guitar. So that with that you can certainly get different sounding guitars and different tunings, and it's very clever. But you can't use that to control other sounds. So I really think that between the bookends of the Stepp and the Jammy, not a lot has changed other than technology is more affordable. But I do like to tell a story that we were, because this, I think, says that the challenge is more to do with behavior and attitude than technology, and that hasn't changed. And maybe people are more open to new interfaces because there's drum pads and Native Instruments macro and things like that, machine. So people are open, and Roly interfaces. People are open to different interfaces, although they're still niche. So we were very fortunate to meet Les Paul when we launched the guitar at NAMM trade show. Les Paul came over, and we spent some time with him, and his reaction was, you're going to have trouble with guitarists. And I was like, oh, that's very discouraging. And what he said, which was very insightful, he said, when I invented the electric guitar and I gave it to guitarists, they said that they didn't like it. It was that they had problems with it. And they said the first problem was that it feeds back. And you know, we can laugh at that today, but his reaction was, well, can't you use that, you know? And he said, well, what else is the problem? And they said, well, you know, if you stand too close to the amplifier and you pluck a string, it just sustains forever. And it's because they didn't have an understanding that this interface of 6 strings and frets could sound different. They just wanted it to amplify. You know, feedback. If you say to a microphone company, you know, my microphone feeds back, that's a problem. The microphone company doesn't say, well, can't you use that? You know, but we forget, because it took guitarists like Hendrix to take that sound and make it into music. That didn't happen overnight. So if a guitarist picks up a digital guitar and plays, let's say, an orchestral sound that doesn't start when you hit it, it has a slow envelope, some guitarists will immediately understand you have to play that differently. Other guitarists will say, oh, tracking is very slow. They won't understand. It's a different sound. So you almost, and this is what Les Paul said to us, you have in this one product an infinite number of guitars. And each one of those guitars, you have to play differently. That's why I think it's okay for some people to say, well, look, I want my guitar, I love this axe, and I just want to be able to control MIDI with that. That's fine for some people. But for other people, you don't have a keyboard that's got an interface into a grand piano. The keyboard is a solid state instrument in its own right. But that, again, didn't happen overnight. So I think the behavioral challenges haven't changed because there haven't been enough people that have taken them, made them their own, and evangelized, what they can do.
And I totally agree. And how much do you think that the entry into making music, how easy it is to start making music has changed from the 80s to now?
Well, it used to be that other than having a reel-to-reel multi-track recorder or some of the Porter studio equipment, you'd have to go into a studio and it was $30 to $50 to $100 an hour. And now with Logic or GarageBand or Ableton and just so many other doors and some libraries, I'm just always blown away that say Spitfire libraries and all the stuff on Native Instruments, and you've got such powerful sounds and such control that you can do so much in the box. So I think that's another thing that Jammy is not just a digital guitar, but it's also a travel guitar. So a Jammy and a MacBook Pro and GarageBand or Logic and a few sample libraries, and you've got quite a huge capability there. It's possibly easier to travel with that setup than even a mini keyboard, because with a mini keyboard it's not so hard, it's not so easy to play because mini keys, but the Jammy fretboard is pretty much full size. So again, with the right-minded musician, you can just do so much.
Do you think that there's some fundamental difference in the perspective of keyboard players and guitar players? Because it seems like the keyboard players might have been a bit faster in adopting the new mindset of like using synthesizers and then MIDI keyboards, whereas or is it that the keys lend themselves more easily to reinterpretation than the stringed instruments?
Well, I think some of it is we've conveniently forgotten the history of the synth. So when synths started, they were monophonic. So the Moog synthesizer, the original Moog, could only play one note at a time. And pianists would say, this isn't a real instrument. It feels plasticky. It can only play one note. But there was a breed of musician that said, well, that one note sounds fantastic. I'm going to play, I'm not pretending it's a piano. And then the next generation could be polyphonic. And then the generation after that started to have aftertouch and weighted keys. And the generation after that, we got MIDI. So after about 15 years, there were more and more synth players. We had the same evolution with electronic drums. So Dave Simmons was involved in the design of this. And the original Simmons drums, hexagonal drum kit, there was a plank of wood pretty much behind that plastic, the rubber head. And a lot of drummers just wreck my wrists playing this. But other drummers said, well, I can now do so much more. So it's the same thing. You first of all have to have an instrument that's affordable and as perfect as possible. And so that's a challenge with a guitar because it's such a difficult interface to get right. And then you need a generation of musicians that are going to show the world what they can do with it. So we're kind of restarting with Jammy. We're at the starting point.
Cool. And do you feel like the digital guitars, in the sense, like Jammy and the Stepp DG1, are they fundamentally different in the kind of approach that you need to take to them than some of the other, like pitch to voltage and other MIDI guitar solutions out there?
That's a really important question, and it will be misunderstood by a lot of people that haven't experienced the different types. So pitch to voltage, first of all, they're getting better and better, but they can never be perfect. So people talk about tracking as the biggest problem because of the pitch to voltage legacy. So if you hit a very low string, just the cycle of that note, a computer has to see that whole note before it can say that's an E. So even if it was perfect, it's still going to be 10, 15, 20 milliseconds, maybe 50 milliseconds. So when you see people playing pitch to voltage guitars, they nearly always play high up the neck, because the higher the note, the easier it is to track. They nearly always play monophonically, because if you play multiple notes, the multiple frequencies, if they're not completely isolated,
split out, isolated,
be confusing to the computer. And there'll also be different speeds. And then they have to be completely in tune, because if your guitar isn't completely in tune, then the computer won't actually work out what note you're playing. So that's why I think a hybrid approach is, in the end, not the right approach. Pitch to voltage is okay. It can be very inexpensive and it can be good enough. But if you want to strum, or you want to play chords and you want to play low as well as high, and you want complete control, you're not going to be able to get the same kind of control over hammer-ons, hammer-offs, pitch bending, slides, muting, palming, everything else. So although it's incredibly difficult to do with a digital guitar, and a digital guitar won't feel like a physical guitar, I think time, those are approaches that we can solve. If you can sense everything, we can turn a guitar, we can change its appearance and its weight. Maybe even like Fatar is a keyboard manufacturer that's in several keyboards. Maybe Jammy can license its fretboard technology to Gibson and Fender and other companies, so that you'll have a Fender digital guitar, a Gibson digital guitar. So who knows how that may evolve. But the first point is to have a really great interface, and not a compromised interface. So pitch to voltage, in my opinion, is always going to be compromised. There are other approaches. So I would say pitch to voltage were originally called guitar synths, like the original Roland. But I would call Jammy and Stepp digital guitars. So there are other instruments. Artiphon is one that has kind of rubber keys and rubber strum pads. They're very weird to play, but they're kind of other approaches. At least there, again, you don't have tracking issues because they're keys.
Yeah.
Jammy and Stepp, these are keys as well, really, but they're open. The string is one part of the key and the fret is the other part of the key. So we also don't have tracking issues. But it still feels different from a guitar. And I think over time, maybe with haptics and other feedback loops of MIDI, we can even, like with digital pianos, compensate for those differences as well. So I think the right approach is a digital guitar, not a guitar synth, not pitch to voltage.
In terms of the use case, which one did you see the Stepp being used for the most? And which one do you feel like the guitar community is most used to?
I think that's a difficult question to answer, because I can see it as a travel guitar. I can see it as a home recording tool to get MIDI control that you can't get with something else. And I can see it as a musician's starting point for creativity, or there will be musicians that this is their primary instrument. I just think that it's a mixture of all those things. It's probably important to say, it may be obvious to a lot of people, but this isn't exactly like triggering a keyboard, because on a keyboard you've only got, say, one middle C. On a guitar, if I play on the fifth fret of the low E string, I get an A, but the next string is an A as well. So if I'm triggering on 6 MIDI channels, I will get 2 of those A's, whereas on a keyboard there's only ever going to be one of them. So it's not just the what I call the language, but it's also, the voicings sound different. If I play a chord on a guitar and then play the same chord on a keyboard, it doesn't sound the same. Apart from strumming, you can kind of try to strum a keyboard. You'd have to fake it, really.
Roll it, really, yeah.
Can't easily slide around. So there's those differences, but it's also the voicings. So coming back to the use case, if I want that particular voicing, I might use an instrument just to do that. But I'm hoping that we get to the time soon where this is somebody's kind of regular tool. It's part of their toolkit, because it's easier for them to control MIDI with this interface rather than a keyboard interface.
And so in terms of the patches, the favorite sounds that you like to trigger, what are your go-to instruments, like virtual instruments?
So I use, big fan of the Spitfire libraries, and I use a lot of the native instrument stuff. I tend to like things that do interpret the muting side, because that seems to be a part of my playing technique. Recently, I've been getting into ambient guitars. I was listening to Daniel Lanois and Eno and people like that, and there's some libraries of ambient guitars that are really very, very cool.
Wondering if we could show a few of those in action, maybe going between the Stepp and the Jammy.
And actually, they're surprisingly similar. So that's quarter-ohm ambient guitars. So, you can hear in the attack a very guitar-like thing, and yet it's a bit synthy. And for me, I'm kind of very interested in those ambient sounds at the moment. And there's very little difference for me in doing this on the Stepp and doing it on Jammy. It's that there's no latency. It's giving me the effect I want. The only issue is what you were saying about how you treat palm muting. But in this particular sound, I'm not using that anyway. And then if I use something else, so there's Una Corda, which is a felt piano. I might have, if I played that on its own. So this is something that if I played on a keyboard would sound would sound piano-y. Frequently with keyboard sounds, if you play them on a digital guitar, they do sound like guitars and not keyboards. But sometimes those voices can, underneath another patch, can sound quite interesting. I just have some random things here. So this is Alchemy in Logic Pro, which has quite good, plucky acoustic sounds and synthy sounds. Can you hear that okay?
Yeah.
So I've got cellos, classical guitar and hybrid keys. But I would probably, this is very much an 80s kind of aha kind of sound. Those are very much synth sounds, because I thought, well, if I'm just playing stuff that sounds like a guitar, you want to maybe hear things that sound synthy. Yeah. Me personally, I tend to like sounds that sound more real, so I use sample libraries a lot. So
what was the guitar patch that you mentioned?
the guitar, I've got two. I've got one classical guitar, which is in an East West library. Um, I think it's kind of bizarre, but very satisfying to be playing something that's a nylon string guitar, yet it's such a digital.
Digital way of arriving at it.
Yeah, because it really does sound pretty realistic, and I'm literally just, this is out of the box. If I spent 10 minutes with that sound or some others, I could get some other squeaks and other things and slides and mutes and other things going on that no one would really know it wasn't the real thing, because it's the combination. So many guitar patches, when you play them on a keyboard, don't sound like guitars, but when you play them with Jammy or Stepp, they do sound like guitars. So that was one of the ones. I've got a synth one, which is from Alchemy, that they call Acoustic Pluck. I think it has that front end of it. It's percussive. There's quite a few in Alchemy that are quite nice.
Outside of the MIDI guitars, what are the things you think are shaping and will shape the music technology in the years forward? Just as a tech and music enthusiast, what kind of trends do you see, and what kind of things do you look forward to just as a musician and a songwriter?
So that's a really interesting question. So I think MPE has a lot of promise, especially for what we've been talking about, because it's trying to, and MPE with MIDI 2 is trying to retroactively make MIDI play nice with things that are more like guitarists, sliding and bending, bending one note of a chord instead of the whole chord. Again, very difficult to do on most keyboards, but with MPE that's now possible. So it's incredibly difficult to set up, but that's a first generation thing. But I think that there's just going to be many more very expressive synths, both in the hardware side and on the software side, and then the libraries. So I think the combination of more affordable technology, more expressive technology, and then libraries that are getting just unbelievably realistic and affordable, most of them. There's a perfect intersection that we're approaching, where something like Jammy really would be potentially the most expressive instrument that you could leverage, because you've got things you can bend, slide, hammer on, hammer off, different voicings, different tunings. Pretty difficult to change the tunings of a piano other than up and up in steps. But with a guitar, you can completely change all the tunings. So it's time for the guitarist really to take center stage, I think, with MIDI, because for a long time, the guitarist was center stage, but really all they had to change their sound was louder and wah-wah pedals and fuzz boxes and echo, which is cool, but it's still, there's a that still put them in a box, whereas all these other libraries are really being triggered from black and white keys and not predominantly from guitars. So I think when a guitarist can trigger those libraries and take them to another level, that's going to be a very interesting thing to watch.
Yeah, and especially it's cool that you mentioned MIDI 2.0, because I'm really looking forward to how the property exchange and other new features are going to work. Being able to hear back from the software as soon as you plug into a software synth, getting a message on the Jammy that, hey, it's me. It's like the Ample Guitar plugin, and the guitar goes instantly into that MIDI preset. That would take so much effort off of the shoulders of the guitarist that they won't need to figure the technology out that much.
And I think you could have recipes or widgets or apps, applets that say you know, somebody's gone in and created this so that if you're using Amplitude or Native Instruments or whatever, you know, just download this recipe, and then Native Instruments will say if it's one of these libraries, it will automatically recognize that this CC control is controlling palm muting, or you know, however you configure it. Somebody's going to go in and do that. I mean, you know, I've got a number of things that once I've configured, that's my setup. But I've also noticed that other people have set them up in different ways, and I might just download their setup to start with. So once you get a community, and I think your community is pretty vocal, and I love, you know, the authenticity of, you know, this is what we're doing, and you know, here's what we're up to. So there's the ability to just share findings and tips, and it, you know, it's not like a secret sauce that I'm not going to tell you how I got my sound. I think it's that you know, just that interconnectivity with MIDI is more likely to foster that community where people say, this is how I do this. And so, you know, I think we're just coming into an intersection of more affordable technology, more expressive technology, MIDI that can play nicer. We're not there yet, but the promise is there. So something else that maybe is part of the digital guitarist is that it's not a one and done thing. If you're buying a digital guitar, you're buying it to help it move forward. You're not just buying it, and like if I buy a keyboard, I don't expect to evolve that. I'm buying it, it does these things, but with a digital guitar, I'm kind of hoping to feed back, you know, can it do this, and then the next rev, can I have these features?
Evolving the product together with the community, it's really important, because everyone plays the instrument slightly different, and everyone, when you ask people what can you imagine being possible with a digital guitar, every guitarist has a sort of unique picture of what they would want to do with it. And it's exciting to be able to implement these ideas, at least some of them.
Well, you can't say yes to everybody. So there's going to be a lot of people that just might say, well, it's really important that you do this setup for Ableton or for MPE, and you know, that might be way down the roadmap, because you know, there's other more fundamental things that you have to do first. But if people understand that there's a balance to this, and that there's going to be updates on a regular basis that just open up a whole tapestry of new sounds, that's really cool.
Yeah, and it's also ties back into something that you said earlier, that you need to first focus on the feel of the hardware plus software, to where it you know, plays more or less naturally, and then the way that you would expect it to. And that's been our focus for a good chunk of this year. We've just focused on the playability, and then sometimes we would, you know, put a cherry on top and add some cool MIDI integration features. We still have room for improvement in that regard, but at the same time, we see that you know, more and more users are embracing this instrument for what it is, and finding great applications and great cool ways to use it in their music. And what we can do is you know, sort of educate them better on how to arrive at that, how to approach this from a mindset perspective, and how to achieve the results that they would like with it.
I think that you're doing a great job, and both in developing and evolving, staying, you know, persevering, and also communicating. And there isn't anything that Jammy can't do that Stepp was doing. So I see Jammy as the next step. I don't mean that as a pun, although it is a pun, unintentionally. It's the next. It's, you know, the stuff we've been talking about can be done in software, and much more. So you know, I have great hope for it, and you know, I hope some of what we've been talking about is going to be useful in the community to set expectations or to inspire.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I look forward to chatting with you sometime again, perhaps once we have the Jammy E out of the pipeline. And yeah, learning even more about some of the Stepp guitar, and hopefully coming back to you showing that some of the ideas that you suggested we've already implemented.
Great. I love that. That's fantastic. Well, yeah, we must do this again, continue it. And if you think of other questions or follow-ups, don't hesitate to ping me.
I hope that you enjoyed this conversation. If you'd like to see more videos like this in the future, let us know in the comments. Hit like and subscribe to the channel. Stay creative.
And you've even got the freedom to create your own weird sounds and then use them to play with. And to cap it all, you can even tune it in a way no guitarist would ever dream of tuning his instrument. And so on, up and up and up, until it reaches beyond human hearing and not a single broken string. Look out, bats. Well, Steve and Randall and your Stepp DG1 guitar, thank you very much for joining us.